live debate. IntelligenceSquared.com.
Some of the conventional default settings of our understanding of political identities are quite shaky. We're not absolutely sure now where the left and the right are. We've seen people historically from the right talking about the big society in terms which I, in my naivety, had always associated with associational socialism and anarcho-syndicalism of the early 20th century. And we've certainly seen people who might identify on the left saying rather more positive things about markets in recent years than you'd ever have expected if you'd grown up in South Wales. But that's simply an indication of the fact that tribal politics is no longer serving us very well. The coalition, whatever you think of that, is one small straw in the wind of a sense that we need to be doing some rethinking about political identities and political possibilities.
Economics has gone down a cul-de-sac over the last 30 or 40 years. It's become heavily mathematical in its attempt to prove itself to be a hard science. Someone once said it's got a bad case of physics envy. And it's not a science, it's an art form. I see it as almost like a form of medieval witchcraft. People sort of toss a few things in the pot and stir them around, and they come up with something which they say is the answer to all our problems. It isn't.
The fact is that the modern economy is dependent upon, based upon dissatisfaction. If we were all satisfied with the things we had, the economy would grind to a halt, whether you're talking about individual gadgets or different cars or whatever it happens to be. And that's a really big problem, and there is no obvious solution to it. I agree that we ought to look at things like advertising. We ought to look at the propaganda that's blasted particularly into children's brains at a very early age, and there are some laws to protect them, but in my view we could be much more imaginative and much braver.
The only way in which economics can be tamed and controlled is by having a proper conception of the good life. What are we here for? You have to answer that question, and the trouble is ethics is very, very weak at the moment because it's really what you want. I mean, people don't agree on what the good life is, what the admirable life is, and as long as they don't agree, consumerism rushes in to fill the vacuum.
What would the economy look like if we managed to discriminate between good and bad growth, just to put it crudely, because that's what we're going to have to do. I mean, we already discriminate, no one rejoices in economic growth based on crime, drugs, and so on. And somehow we're going to have to learn to reject growth based on environmental destruction. But I think growth as a term has become a bit of a catch-all. I mean, I would like to see the monopoly of Tesco, for example, heavily challenged by government. I don't think it's something consumers can do. I think we've lost all bargaining power up against these enormously powerful corporations.
It seems to me one's almost sold the pass here by accepting individualism as a premise, which many other civilizations don't. And I think it's almost inevitable that it would be in a Christian civilization. I mean, in a way, that's the weakness of Christianity, because political liberalism comes from that root. But I mean, if you accept individualism as a premise, you're driven to self-interest as a premise. Really, I mean, the self is the key thing. And then if you say, oh well, but what about altruism and concern for the community? They're simply aspects of self-interest, and they make you feel good. I mean, but then someone says, but being altruistic doesn't make me feel good, as a matter of fact, and then you've got no answer, you see. Now, I think that the Asian civilizations aren't based on the principle of individualism. And in a way, they can tackle some of these problems better than we can, just because they do accept the community is overriding.
Oddly, China, I mean, they're the opposite of America in the sense that their action at home is more impressive than we all think, because they're very bad at selling that story, whereas America's action at home is useless, but Obama's very good at selling a story. So actually, in Copenhagen, it was quite unfair what happened to China. It was very clever politics by Obama or his team to pin the blame on China when they knew that they'd arrived at that conference absolutely empty-handed, but they didn't want to be punished for it. So it was politics really were to play there.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Keynes, when he was writing 90 years ago, 90 years ago, said that he thought that by this stage, in 2 generations, when his grandchildren were alive, they would be working 15 hours a week and that they would be 4 times as rich. Well, we're now 8 times as rich, as Keynes was wrong about that, but we're still working 40-hour weeks. We do seem to prefer consumerism over the leisure society that Keynes envisaged. I mean, he envisages reading, improving books and learning musical instruments and living what he conceived to be the good life. And actually, we haven't embraced that view of the world.
Relentless pressure of advertising is one element in this. I mean, I think that's something. Our choices are framed for us in a certain way. And lots of things that people might want to do are unavailable. I certainly have enormous sympathy for all local initiatives, have to recognize that it does imply an increase in inequality, because the state is a vast equalizing sort of machine. Uniformity, equalization, redistribution where necessary or where desirable. That is the state's function. Now, if you take localism too far, you're just going to get different levels of services, all kinds of things. Now, are we prepared to face that? I think not, actually.
I think this issue of third world development versus, well, the tension between that, I suppose, and environmental considerations is really important. But there is a dishonesty in the argument that says that those countries should be able to catch up, because they can't. We developed over a long period of time, partly as a result of the fact that we had access to colonies around the world. I think it's time, actually, that we start being very critical of the development model which has been imposed, been thrust on third world countries really for the last 50 years by the IMF. It's a development model which creates incredible vulnerability and poverty. And so much of what we see as poverty alleviation programs generated via the World Bank or IMF are nothing of the sort. Effectively going to a country saying, sell off your natural capital, do away with your domestic, diverse, localized agriculture, pool all your resources into intensive agriculture for export, and throw yourself at the mercy of world commodity markets over which you have no control at all. And when that experiment fails, there's nothing left for them other than extreme vulnerability. And President Clinton, former President Clinton, apologized only 2 weeks ago, a bit too late, but he apologized 2 weeks ago for using aid as an excuse to dump GM and other forms of castaway agricultural produce from the United States on countries, and accepted for the first time that absolutely destroyed their agricultural base and created even more vulnerability. So I think we've got to be very critical about the development model, because it hasn't delivered.
I wanted to come back to the evolutionary question, if I may.
Oh,
because
you were definitely going to get that anyway. I was going to make sure that you tackled that one.
Very important question, not least speaking as a primate.